The fourth abdominal thrust from the celebrated surgeon was a brutal, useless thing. Julian Croft's magnificent, custom-tailored suit bunched under Dr. Alistair Finch's desperate grip, but the piece of A5 Wagyu, a morsel costing more than most people's weekly groceries, remained lodged in his throat, a perfect, lethal plug. The billionaire's face, a canvas accustomed to the confident tan of yacht decks and golf courses, had cycled through the alarming spectrum of red to a deep, bruised violet. Now, as his body sagged, a ghastly final shade of slate grey began to creep in. Clara Maeve had less than a minute before the man's brain would begin to starve. A minute to decide. She could remain invisible, another black-clad servant in this temple of obscene wealth, and watch a man die. Or she could act, using the knowledge her grandmother Amina had pressed into her hands like a sacred, secret inheritance, on the sun-baked porch of their small New Mexico home. A knowledge the world had forgotten, a knowledge that might get her arrested. The silence in Aurelia, Manhattan's 3 Michelin-star pinnacle of gastronomy, was a physical weight. It crushed the air, smothered the delicate tinkle of a distant piano, and froze the waiters in poses of suspended animation. The light from the constellation of Swarovski chandeliers seemed to dim, focusing its entire glare on Table 1, the Emperor's Table, where Julian Croft, the tech visionary whose algorithms shaped the daily lives of billions, was being extinguished. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, bulged with a primal terror that no amount of wealth could shield him from. His hands, which signed deals that shifted global markets, clawed at the starched collar of his shirt, a desperate animal trying to rip its own cage open for a single gasp of air. Dr. Finch, chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Lenox Hill, and a man whose ego was as renowned as his surgical skill, was failing. He was performing the Heimlich maneuver with textbook precision, yet it was like trying to knock down a brick wall with a feather. At a nearby table, his colleague, Dr. Eleanor Vance, a respected neurologist, was on the phone with 911, her voice a tight, controlled tremor that belied the rising panic in her eyes. 1, 2, 3, Dr. Finch grunted, his face slick with sweat, his own expensive suit straining at the seams. Each upward thrust was met with a sickening lack of result. Julian Croft's body was becoming a dead weight. Panic, once a contained ripple, now became a tidal wave. Diners, their $100 appetizers forgotten, scrambled back from their tables. A woman stifled a scream behind a silk napkin. The maître d', a man named Dubois, who moved with the reptilian grace of someone who served the powerful, hissed into his earpiece, his face a mask of horrified liability. Nearly a minute had passed. The clock was ticking not just on Julian Croft's life, but on his mind, his memories, his empire. And then there was Clara. At 26, she was a ghost in the machine of New York City. Her life was a patchwork of survival, serving tables at night at Aurelia, a job she'd landed through sheer persistence, and by day, volunteering at a community clinic in the Bronx, translating for elderly immigrants who spoke Farsi and Arabic, dialects she'd learned at her grandmother's knee. She'd come to the city with a small inheritance and a head full of Amina's stories, dreams of studying traditional medicine. But the city had a way of grinding dreams into dust. The student loans were a mountain, the rent a ravenous beast. She had been clearing Table 7 when the first choked gasp had cut through the restaurant's decorous hum. She'd watched, her heart a cold stone in her chest, as the scene unfolded. She recognized Julian Croft from the covers of magazines, a titan of the modern age, a man who lived in the future. Now, his future was being measured in seconds. She watched Dr. Finch's technique, the brute force of it. He was treating the body like a faulty machine, and a memory, vivid and fragrant with the scent of desert sage and chamomile tea, rose in her mind. Amina, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, sitting on their porch. "The body is not a machine, Habibti," she would say, her hands gently kneading Clara's shoulders. "It is a river. When something blocks the river, you do not batter the dam. You find the hidden channels. You persuade the water to flow another way. The old ways, they know how to whisper to the body, not shout at it." Clara's feet were moving before her mind gave its full consent. She placed her tray of empty glasses on a nearby stand, the clink of crystal unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence. She began to push through the ring of horrified onlookers. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. No one paid her any mind. "Excuse me," she repeated, louder this time, her tone carrying an authority that surprised even herself. Dr. Finch shot her a venomous glare, his frustration needing a target. "Get back! This is a medical emergency! Security!" But Clara wasn't looking at the doctor. She was looking at Julian Croft, and in the fading light of his eyes, she saw not a billionaire, not a symbol of power, but a man drowning on dry land, a man terrified of the dark, and she heard Amina's voice, as clear as if she were standing beside her. "Fear closes the channels, Clara. Your touch must be confident. Your heart must be calm. You are the river guide." "I can help him," Clara said, her voice ringing with a strange, unshakable certainty. "Please, there is another way." The maître Dubois materialized at her side, his face pinched with fury. "Miss Maeve, return to your station this instant! You are fired! Do you hear me? Fired!" He reached for her arm, but she sidestepped him, her movements fluid and economical. She ignored the rising shouts, the approach of two burly security guards. She had eyes only for Julian Croft. She came to his side, not behind him. She placed a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. "Sir," she said, her voice low and calm, cutting through the chaos. "My name is Clara. I'm going to help you. You have to trust me. Try to relax your body." Then she did something that made the entire room gasp in collective shock. Instead of wrapping her arms around his torso for another violent thrust, she did the opposite. She placed one hand on his upper chest for support, and with the other, she reached around to his back. But she didn't strike. Her fingers, long and sensitive from years of learning her grandmother's craft, didn't form a fist. They spread, landing with impossible softness on the space just below his neck, between the shoulder blades. Her thumb and forefinger found two small indentations on either side of his spine. "What in God's name is she doing?" Dr. Vance whispered, her 911 call forgotten. "She's going to cause a spinal injury." Dr. Finch took a step forward. "Stop her, now, that's assault." But Clara was in another world, a world of muscle and nerve, of energy pathways her grandmother called Masarat. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, picturing the diagram Amina had drawn for her in the dirt with a stick, the convergence of nerves, the gate that controlled the body's convulsive reflexes. "Not force, Habibti," Amina's voice echoed in her memory. "Pressure." A sudden, deep whisper. "You are not hitting him. You are reminding his body how to save itself." She applied a sudden, sharp, inward pressure with her thumb and finger, a precise, targeted pulse of energy that was less a blow and more a profound neurological suggestion. She held it for a single, impossibly long second. For a heartbeat, nothing. The slate grey of Julian Croft's face deepened. A collective groan of despair filled the room. Dr. Finch lunged forward to pull her away, and then it happened. It wasn't the violent projectile the Heimlich aims for. It was a different kind of release. Julian Croft's body convulsed, but it was an inward, muscular contraction. A deep, shuddering spasm originated not in his abdomen, but in his diaphragm. There was a strange, wet, guttural sound, and the piece of steak slid from his throat, dislodged not by force, but by the body's own powerful, redirected reflex. He collapsed forward onto the table, a great, ragged, whooping gasp tearing from his lungs. It was the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. Air, precious and life-giving, flooded his system. He coughed, a deep, rattling sound, and then began to breathe, each inhalation a raw, desperate miracle. The restaurant exploded, not with applause, but with a cacophony of sound and motion. People surged forward. Dr. Finch, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, shoved Clara aside. "Get out of the way!" he snarled, immediately beginning to check Julian's pulse, his professional composure a flimsy shield for his shattered ego. "He's breathing," Dr. Vance confirmed, rushing to Julian's other side. "His pulse is thready, but it's there. Oxygen saturation will be low, but he's breathing." Clara stumbled back, the adrenaline draining from her body in a dizzying rush, leaving her knees weak and her hands trembling. She had done it. The whispering hand, Amina's technique, had worked. Julian Croft slowly pushed himself upright, leaning heavily on the table. His immaculate suit was ruined, his face was pale and slick with sweat, but his stormy eyes were clear and fiercely alive. He looked around, disoriented, his gaze passing over the anxious doctors, the gawking diners, until it landed on her. He stared at Clara, a girl in a cheap black uniform who stood apart from the crowd. "You," he rasped, his voice a raw whisper. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "It was you." Before she could answer, before anyone could react, he pushed himself away from the table and took a staggering step toward her. The two security guards moved to intercept, but he waved them away with a gesture that, even in his weakened state, commanded obedience. He stopped in front of her, so close she could see the burst capillaries in his eyes. He reached out and grabbed her hand. His own was shaking violently. This man, who moved markets and conversed with presidents, was trembling like a frightened child. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice gaining a sliver of its customary strength. "What did you do? The doctors. They were killing me." "But you—" Clara swallowed, the focus of 200 pairs of eyes making her skin prickle. "My name is Clara Maeve," she said, her voice soft but steady. "My grandmother taught me. She was a healer from a small Bedouin tribe in the Jordanian highlands. It's an old technique. It works with the body's nerves, not against them." Julian's grip on her hand tightened. His eyes, now glistening with unshed tears, searched her face. "Bedouin," he repeated, the word a strange prayer on his lips. "My God. My own grandmother. She was from the Anaza tribe. I haven't thought about that in 40 years. He looked from her face to his own shaking hands, then at the opulent room around them. "I built an empire on ones and zeros, on logic, on predicting the future, and I almost died because I couldn't swallow a piece of meat." He looked back at her, his expression one of profound, world-altering wonder. And a girl who remembers the past, who remembers the whispers of the desert. "You gave me back my breath." The moment was shattered by Dr. Alistair Finch. He had regained his composure and was now radiating an aura of pure, undiluted rage. "This is outrageous," he boomed, his voice echoing in the now quiet room. "This woman who has no medical training whatsoever performed an unknown, unapproved, and reckless maneuver on Mr. Croft. She could have severed his spinal cord. She assaulted him. I demand that she be arrested." Dubois, the maitre d', scurried forward, seeing his chance to regain control and shift blame. "He's right! She was insubordinate! I fired her on the spot! Security, restrain her! The police are on their way!" The two guards, who had been watching the scene with stunned expressions, now moved toward Clara, their faces grim and uncertain. The crowd murmured, the mood shifting from awe to confusion and suspicion. Clara felt a cold dread wash over her. She had saved a man's life, and now she was going to jail. But Julian Croft was not a man who relinquished control for long. He released Clara's hand and turned to face Dr. Finch. Though his voice was still raw, it held the unmistakable ring of absolute power. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "will be silent." Dr. Finch opened his mouth to retort, but the look in Julian's eyes stopped him cold. It was the look of a predator, a man who could financially ruin him with a single phone call and enjoy doing it. Julian then turned his gaze on Dubois. "And you? You fired her?" "Sir, she violated every protocol. The liability—" Dubois stammered, wilting under the intensity of that stare. "The only liability I see in this room, Dubois," Julian said, his voice dropping even lower, "is a 3-star restaurant that was about to let me die on its floor. This young woman didn't violate protocol. She saved it. She saved you from the biggest corporate manslaughter lawsuit in the history of this city." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Now get me a chair and get Miss Maeve a chair. We are going to sit down, and then you are going to call my personal legal team. Their number is in my wallet. Tell them to get here." Now. The paramedics arrived in a storm of organized chaos, their efficiency a stark contrast to the high society panic that had preceded them. They swarmed Julian, their questions sharp and rapid-fire as they checked his vitals and examined his bruised throat. Dr. Finch, ever the professional, provided a clipped, medical summary of the event, conveniently omitting the part where his 4 attempts had failed, and pointedly referring to Clara's intervention as an unauthorized physical interaction by a staff member. Julian waved them off, his irritation palpable. "I'm breathing. That's all that matters." His gaze kept finding Clara, who stood by the now abandoned table 7, feeling like a ghost at her own execution. The lead paramedic, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, shone a penlight into Julian's eyes. "Sir, we need to transport you to the hospital. A choking event of this severity can lead to esophageal tearing, aspiration pneumonia, or delayed swelling." "I'll go," Julian conceded, finally allowing them to help him to his feet. "But not before I speak with her." He pointed directly at Clara. The entire room, which had begun to return to a low hum, fell silent again. Dubois stepped forward, his face pale. "Mr. Croft, I really must insist. She is no longer an employee. For legal reasons." Julian Croft laughed. It was a raw, painful sound, but it was a genuine laugh. "Legal reasons? You pathetic little man. You think I'm going to sue the woman who saved my life? Get out of my sight before I buy this building, just for the pleasure of evicting you." Dubois vanished, as if vaporized. Julian walked over to Clara, the paramedics hovering around him like anxious satellites. He looked her up and down, taking in the slightly frayed collar of her uniform, the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet dignity in her posture. "Clara Maeve," he said, tasting the name. "My grandmother's name was Salma. She used to tell me stories about the desert stars. I thought they were just fairy tales." He shook his head, a look of profound regret crossing his features. "I have a meeting with my board of directors in Tokyo tomorrow. I was going to unveil a new predictive algorithm that will make my company another $100 billion. He paused. "And an hour ago, None of that mattered more than a single breath of air. He reached into his jacket, his hand still not entirely steady, and pulled out a slim, titanium wallet. He extracted a single black business card. It contained nothing but his name, a phone number, and a private email address. "I'm going to the hospital," he said, pressing the card into her hand. "My lawyers are coming here. They will handle this." He gestured vaguely at Dr. Finch, who was now conferring with Dr. Vance, his face a thundercloud. "Do not speak to anyone until they arrive. Do not sign anything. Do not leave. They will take care of you. Understand?" Clara nodded numbly, the cold, heavy card feeling alien in her palm. "I will call you the moment I am discharged," he continued, his voice urgent. "We have a great deal to talk about your grandmother, about everything." The paramedics were insistent now, and he finally allowed them to guide him toward the door. As he left, he looked back over his shoulder one last time, his eyes locking with hers. "Don't disappear, Clara Maeve," he said, and it sounded less like a request and more like a command. The moment he was gone, the room became a pressure cooker. Dr. Finch strode over to Clara, his face contorted with a righteous fury. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed, keeping his voice low so the remaining diners couldn't hear. "You think you're a hero? You're a reckless, ignorant girl who got lucky. I'm a board-certified surgeon with 25 years of experience. The Heimlich is a scientifically proven maneuver. Your little parlor trick is undocumented witchcraft. I'm filing a report with the AMA. I'm going to have you charged. You will never work in any capacity related to healthcare again. You are a danger to the public." Clara shrank back, his venomous words striking her like physical blows. Was he right? Had she just been lucky? Had she risked this man's life on a half-remembered story from her grandmother? Doubt, cold and sickening, began to seep into her veins. Before she could respond, a new presence made itself known. 3 people in dark, impeccably tailored suits had entered the restaurant and were now approaching their small, tense group. The leader was a woman in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair cut in a severe silver bob. "Dr. Finch?" she said, her voice cool and precise. "I'm Evelyn Reed. I'm Mr. Croft's general counsel. I believe you were just threatening my client's rescuer." She didn't raise her voice, but the threat was unmistakable. Dr. Finch puffed out his chest. "Your client was the victim of an assault by this untrained employee." Evelyn Reed held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "I have 3 eyewitnesses, all of whom are partners at major law firms, who will testify that you were failing to render effective aid and that my client was turning grey. I also have the restaurant's security footage, which my team is currently securing. Furthermore, Mr. Croft has already given me a statement via phone from the ambulance. His exact words were, 'That woman is a goddamned angel. Dr. Finch is an incompetent butcher. Take care of her, and then dismantle him.'" She gave him a smile that was all teeth. "So, if you'd like to continue this conversation, I'd be happy to have one of my associates take your statement. For the lawsuit, Mr. Croft will be filing against you for malpractice and slander." Dr. Finch's face went completely white. He looked from Evelyn Reed's merciless expression to Clara, and for the first time, a flicker of fear entered his eyes. He turned on his heel and stalked out of the restaurant without another word. Evelyn Reed then turned her attention to Clara. Her expression softened, but only slightly. "Miss Maeve, I'm sorry you had to endure that. Julian, Mr. Croft, is extremely grateful and extremely insistent that we ensure your well-being." She glanced around the now emptying dining room. This is not the place. We've booked you a suite at the Carlisle. My associate will escort you. We'll talk in the morning, after you've had a chance to rest." "A suite? The Carlisle?" Clara stammered. "I can't. I have to go home. I have my job at the clinic in the morning." "You no longer work at this restaurant," Evelyn said, with a nod toward Dubois, who was trying to make himself invisible behind a potted fern. "And I think you'll find you won't need the clinic job much longer either. Julian is a very generous man when he's grateful, and a very formidable one when he's not." She handed Clara another business card. "My personal number. Call if you need anything at all. A car will take you wherever you need to go in the morning. For now, get some sleep. You've had quite a night." Clara didn't sleep. The suite at the Carlisle was larger than her entire apartment, a hushed, opulent cocoon of silk and polished wood overlooking Central Park. She sat on the edge of a bed that felt too big, too soft, and watched the city lights twinkle below. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly. A shaky video of the incident, filmed by one of the diners, had already been posted online and was spreading like wildfire. The headlines were sensational. "Waitress saves tech billionaire with mysterious death touch as top surgeon fails." There were thousands of comments. Many called her a hero, an angel, but just as many were skeptical, even hostile. They echoed Dr. Finch. She was a fraud, a quack who got lucky. People posted links to medical journals, dissecting the video, calling her technique dangerous. She felt a wave of nausea. Her grandmother's legacy, her sacred knowledge, was being turned into a viral spectacle, a piece of digital gossip to be consumed and discarded. At 3 a.m, she opened the worn, leather-bound journal she always carried in her bag. It was filled with her grandmother Amina's handwriting, a mix of elegant Arabic script and spidery English. She found the page where Amina had sketched the human back, marking the spot between the scapulae. She'd called it Bab al-Hayat, the gate of life. "It is not magic, Clara," she had written. "It is knowledge. The large nerve cluster here, the vagus nerve, it controls the breath, the heart, the gut. It is the master switch. The modern doctors, they are afraid of it. They shock the heart. They push the stomach. They forget to speak to the master. A sudden, focused pressure, like a key in a lock, can reset a panicked system. It tells the diaphragm to expel, not the stomach to regurgitate. It is the body's own wisdom, awakened." Reading the words, Clara felt a measure of calm return. It wasn't luck. It was knowledge. It was just knowledge the world had chosen to forget. The next morning, a sleek black car took her not to her tiny apartment, but to a gleaming skyscraper in the financial district, Julian Croft's personal office. She was escorted to the top floor, to a penthouse office that seemed to float above the city. Julian was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over his kingdom. He was dressed in a simple grey cashmere sweater and dark trousers. He looked tired, but the near-death pallor was gone, replaced by a strange, new intensity. A faint purple bruise was visible on his throat, above the collar of his sweater. Thank you, the silence in the Carlisle suite was a different species from the one that had suffocated the restaurant. That silence had been a predator, thick with panic and the metallic taste of impending death. This was a curated, expensive silence, woven from soundproofed walls, plush carpets, and the hushed reverence of old money. It was the silence of a tomb, and Clara Maeve felt as though she had been buried alive in it. She stood before the vast window, a small, dark figure in a borrowed hotel robe, looking down at the river of lights that was Fifth Avenue. Below, the city pulsed with a life she no longer felt a part of. She was a ghost, haunting a gilded cage she hadn't chosen. Her phone, which she'd finally silenced, lay on the marble-topped nightstand, a dark mirror reflecting a distorted version of herself that had been born just hours ago. Whispering Hand, Angel of Aurelia. Death Touch Waitress. She had become a hashtag, a flickering piece of digital confetti, her life's story compressed into a sensationalist headline. Sleep was an impossibility. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in the restaurant, the scent of fear and seared duck fat thick in her nostrils. She saw Julian Croft's face, that terrible, bloated mask of purple-grey, his eyes bulging, not with the arrogance of a titan, but the primal terror of a drowning animal. She felt the ghost of his spine beneath her fingertips, the precise, terrifying moment of commitment when she pressed, praying to a god she barely knew, and a grandmother she missed with every fibre of her being. She had felt the deep, seismic shudder of his body as it chose life, the glorious, ragged sound of his first breath. And then the chaos, the snarling face of Dr. Finch, the cold, assessing eyes of the lawyer, Evelyn Reed, the crushing weight of a billionaire's gratitude, which felt more like a form of ownership. She had saved a man, but in doing so, she had lost herself. The quiet, determined woman who volunteered at a Bronx clinic, who found solace in the faded ink of her grandmother's journal, had been erased. In her place was this public curiosity, this miracle worker, this fraud. The doubt that Dr. Finch had so venomously planted had taken root in the fertile soil of her exhaustion. Had it been knowledge, or a one-in-a-billion fluke? Had she been a conduit for ancient wisdom, or a reckless girl who nearly snapped a man's neck? The line between healer and killer felt terrifyingly thin. Miles away, in a private wing of Lenox Hill that resembled a five-star hotel more than a hospital, Julian Croft was also staring into the darkness. The doctors had pumped him full of sedatives, but his mind, a machine accustomed to running at 1,000 revolutions per minute, refused to shut down. It kept replaying the loop, the exquisite taste of the Wagyu, the sudden, perfect seal in his throat, the humiliating, frantic clawing at his own collar. He could still feel the phantom pressure of Dr. Finch's fists, a brutal, rhythmic pummeling that had felt less like rescue and more like a final, undignified assault. And then, the other feeling. The stillness, the calm voice cutting through the red haze of his panic, a gentle hand on his shoulder. And then, the touch. It wasn't a blow. It was a key turning in a lock deep inside his own wiring. He had felt a switch flip in his brainstem, a command that bypassed his conscious thought, and his body had obeyed, convulsing with a power he didn't know it possessed. It was the most profound loss of control he had ever experienced, and it had saved his life. He, Julian Croft, a man who had built a global empire on the cold, hard logic of predictive algorithms, whose every waking moment was dedicated to controlling outcomes, had been saved by something he couldn't quantify. It was a whisper in a world he had built of shouts. The realization was a tectonic shift beneath the foundations of his reality. His fortune, his power, his intellect, they had all been useless against a single, poorly chewed piece of meat. In the final calculus, his life had been bought back, not by his billions, but by the inherited memory in a young woman's hands. His grandmother Salma's face floated in his memory. He saw her as a boy, sitting in the shade of a date palm in a dusty courtyard, telling him that the desert had a voice if you knew how to listen. He had been impatient, eager to get back to his new handheld video game. He had dismissed her stories as the ramblings of old age. Now, In the sterile silence of his hospital room, he could almost hear the desert wind, and it sounded like a lament for a part of himself he had allowed to die 40 years ago. For 2 days, the silence between them stretched, mediated by the cool efficiency of Evelyn Reed. Clara was moved from the Carlisle to a discreet, high-security residence. A generous salary was deposited into her bank account, a sum so large it felt like a clerical error. Evelyn assured her it was a retainer for her consultation and cooperation. Clara felt like a specimen being preserved, a witness being managed. She refused the offers of a personal shopper and a private chef, instead walking the unfamiliar, pristine streets of her new neighborhood, a ghost in another woman's life. She spent her hours poring over Amina's journal, not for answers, but for anchorage. The familiar Arabic script was the only thing that felt real. Julian, against all medical advice, discharged himself. He returned to his penthouse, a sterile glass box in the sky, and tried to resume his life. He took conference calls, analyzed market projections, and mapped out the next 5 years of his company's global domination. But the code felt meaningless. The numbers were just dead things on a screen. The world he had built, once a thrilling testament to his own genius, now felt like an elaborate, empty cage. The memory of suffocation was a physical presence. He would wake in the night, gasping, his hands at his own throat. He was a man haunted by the ghost of his last breath. He knew he had to see her. But the impulse was complicated by a lifetime of habit. His mind immediately began to frame it as a transaction. He would reward her, set her up for life. He would create a project, a philanthropic initiative, something to contain and define what she had done, to translate her whisper into the loud, legible language of capital and influence that he understood. He instructed Evelyn to draw up the preliminary paperwork for a foundation. It was a classic Julian Croft solution, decisive, massive, and utterly impersonal. Evelyn delivered the proposal to Clara in a sleek, leather-bound folder. It detailed the creation of the Maeve Institute, with a 9-figure endowment dedicated to the study of alternative medical practices. Clara would be its public face, its founding director. It was a kingdom handed to her on a silver platter. Clara stared at the folder on the polished mahogany table of her temporary home. The Maeve Institute. They had taken her name, but it felt like they had stolen her soul. They were trying to brand her grandmother's sacred knowledge to turn Bab al-Hayat into a corporate mission statement. This wasn't an act of gratitude, it was an acquisition. He was trying to buy the miracle, to own the whisper. She picked up her phone and called Evelyn Reed. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I can't accept this. None of it. Not the money, not the apartment, not the institute. Please send a car to take me back to my apartment in the Bronx." "Miss Maeve," Evelyn began, her tone a careful blend of patience and warning. "Mr. Croft is a very determined man. This is an incredible opportunity." "It's an incredible cage," Clara replied softly. "My grandmother's knowledge isn't for sale. It's not a brand. It's a gift. And it's meant to be shared, not leveraged." She hung up before Evelyn could argue further. When Julian was informed of her refusal, he didn't erupt in the way his executives might have expected. Instead, he felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion, a cocktail of frustration, confusion, and a startling flicker of respect. She had refused his world. She had refused his power. For the first time in decades, someone had looked at the kingdom he offered and simply said no. He realized, with a jolt that was almost as profound as the one that had restarted his breathing, that he had approached this all wrong. He had been shouting again, He found her 2 days later. Not through his security team, but by doing something he hadn't done in years. He looked for her himself. He knew she volunteered at a community clinic in the Bronx. He took a simple town car, not his armored Maybach, and had the driver wait a block away. He walked into the small, bustling clinic, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a dozen languages. He, the man who was a household name, was completely anonymous here. He was just another anxious face in a waiting room full of them. He saw her in a small office, sitting beside an elderly Hispanic woman, patiently translating a doctor's instructions into gentle, reassuring Spanish. She was wearing simple jeans and a worn sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked tired, but she looked real. She looked more at home here, in this place of quiet, everyday healing, than she ever had in the opulent spaces he had tried to place her in. He waited until she was finished, his heart pounding with an unidentifiable emotion. When she saw him standing in the doorway, she didn't look surprised, only weary. She led him to a small, cluttered break room that smelled of stale coffee. "Mr. Croft," she began, her arms crossed over her chest. "Julian," he corrected, his voice hoarse. "Please call me Julian." He stood there, this titan of industry, looking profoundly out of place amidst the peeling linoleum and mismatched chairs. "I was wrong," he said, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "The foundation, the money, that was my language. My way of trying to control something I don't understand. It was arrogant. I apologize." Clara watched him, her expression unreadable. The apology hung in the air between them, a fragile, unexpected thing. "My grandmother's name was Salma," he said, his gaze distant. "She was from the Anaza. She knew things, about the stars, about the plants. She tried to teach me." He looked at Clara, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, filled with a raw vulnerability she had only glimpsed in the moment of his dying. "I didn't listen. I built an empire of noise because I was afraid of the silence she lived in. I thought her knowledge was obsolete, but it wasn't. It was patient. It was waiting." This was not the man from the restaurant, nor the magnate from the proposal. This was someone new, someone broken, and trying to piece himself back together. Clara felt her defensiveness begin to melt away. She uncrossed her arms. Her name was Amina, she said softly. She reached into her worn canvas bag and pulled out the leather-bound journal. It felt like she was revealing a part of her own soul. She opened it not to the diagram of Bab al-Hayat, but to a page of pressed desert flowers, their colors faded to gentle ghosts. She wasn't a magician. She was an observer. She believed the body, like the desert, had its own wisdom. You just had to be quiet enough to hear it. He sank into one of the rickety chairs, his large frame seeming to shrink. "Teach me how to listen," he whispered. It was not a demand. It was a plea. And so began their true dialogue, not in boardrooms, but in the break room of the clinic, in a small coffee shop in her neighborhood, on a bench in a park. He didn't offer solutions. He asked questions. She didn't lecture. She told stories. She spoke of Amina, of a life lived in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world. She explained that the whispering hand was not a singular trick, but the culmination of a philosophy, an understanding of the body as a river of energy, not a collection of faulty parts. The campaign against her, led by a vindictive Dr. Finch, was still raging in the medical journals and on television. He painted her as a dangerous charlatan, a threat to evidence-based medicine. Julian's old instinct was to unleash his legal army and crush him, but Clara urged a different path. "He's not evil, Julian," she said one afternoon. "He's afraid. His world is built on a specific kind of certainty. What I did, it's like telling a mathematician that a beautiful poem can solve an equation. It threatens his entire reality. Shouting back at him won't make him listen." Inspired, Julian did something unprecedented. He penned an open letter, published in major newspapers and medical journals worldwide. He did not attack Dr. Finch. He did not defend Clara with legal threats. Instead, he told the story of his grandmother, Salma. He wrote about his own arrogance, his dismissal of her wisdom, and how that same arrogance, embodied by the modern medical establishment, had almost killed him. He announced he was not funding an institute to prove folk remedies were right. He was endowing a new kind of library. "We have spent a century building a magnificent library of scientific knowledge," he wrote. "But in the process, we have let other libraries, the libraries of indigenous and traditional wisdom, burn to the ground. My goal is not to replace one with the other. It is to build a bridge between them. I am creating the Amina Salma Archives, a project dedicated to finding, preserving, and facilitating a dialogue between these different ways of knowing. We will not seek to validate ancient wisdom with modern tools, as that is the height of arrogance. We will seek to listen, to learn, and to ask new questions. Our first acquisition will be the journal of a Bedouin healer named Amina. Our first research fellow will be her granddaughter, Clara Maeve. The letter changed the conversation. It was humble, intelligent, and deeply personal. It reframed the debate from a battle between science and superstition into a call for intellectual humility and collaboration. The attacks from Dr. Finch began to sound shrill and dogmatic, while the archives captured the imagination of a world weary of shouting. A year later, Clara stood on a sun-baked mesa in New Mexico, the land her grandmother had once walked. The wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth. There was no gleaming building, no massive campus. The Amina Salma Archives were housed in a modest, beautiful adobe structure designed to blend into the landscape. Inside, there were not just scientists and anthropologists, but tribal elders, herbalists, and healers from around the globe, their voices recorded, their knowledge transcribed not as data, but as stories. Julian stood beside her. He was leaner, his face weathered by the desert sun. He had spent the past 6 months living not in a penthouse, but in a small house nearby, learning Arabic from a local tutor and spending his days in the archive, simply listening. He had relinquished control of his company to a trusted successor, finding that the silence he once feared was now the most valuable commodity he possessed. He touched the faint, silvery scar on his throat. "I keep thinking about that night," he said, his voice quiet. "The whole world saw a billionaire saved by a waitress. But that wasn't the story." "What was the story?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. He looked at her, his stormy eyes clear and calm, reflecting the vastness of the desert sky. A man who had forgotten how to breathe was saved by a woman who had never forgotten how to listen. The wind whispered around them, a language older than science, older than empires, and for the first time they were both fluent. It was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the sound of a long-held breath, finally, peacefully, being released.